Welcome to a question and answer edition of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get started, a word from our sponsors. The first is TeamBuildr and their new software, Gym Studio. If you are a gym owner and you're tired of juggling spreadsheets, membership lists, and chasing down client payments, Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software, and you can get a free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes by heading to gymstudio.com. Our second sponsor is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is an amazing jump testing and training enhancement device. It measures counter movement jumps, contact times, reactive strength, and is programmable for jump testing. And you can also string not just one, but multiple mats together for doing jumps in series, hurdle hops, bounding, and gathering contact times, reactive strength, and adding that extra layer to that plyometric session. To check out more about the Plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. Let's get on to the questions here, and we'll start with a few that got rolled over from the last round that I wasn't able to get to on the last Q&A. We'll start here with Coach Grimm. This is a fantastic question, and he asks, do you risk foot/ankle elasticity when trying to improve ankle mobility/pronation mechanics? This question reminds me of something I had heard about track coaches and people who were coaching track around in this time period of like the 80s, maybe it was the 70s, somewhere in there, the legend, or I wouldn't say it's a legend, but the coaches were saying that if athletes did a lot of deep squatting, that would hurt the elasticity in their lower leg, their Achilles, their feet. And of course, with good squatting, you have to have good knee bending ability. To have good knee bending ability, especially if the feet are flat on the ground, you have to have a lot of ankle mobility. You have to have a lot of motion. You could say stretch at the ankle. And conversely, a lot of jumpers, a lot of good jumpers, a lot of athletes. We've had coaches on this show. Eric Huddleston, I know, have talked about NBA players who don't have a lot of ankle range of motion. And so the question is, if an athlete is presenting this, they've compensated this way, they're very explosive like this, how much do we want to change with their physiology and their biomechanics to try to get them to do something in the gym? Is it worth it? Is it going to help them prevent injury? And my point for this, or the place of balance that I would lean towards, is simply trying to help athletes have good general squatting mechanics, and not so much squatting mechanics that force the ankle mobility or force the knees forward, but more a total body squat that helps the whole body to have this nice sequence of external to external rotation that can line and stack the joints up well, and then works with that. And so by that, I mean doing things like a Hatfield squat with the heels elevated or on a slant board, which setup would be you have plates, or you're standing on a slanted board so the heels are higher than the toes. Your hands are holding on the handles so you can stack the torso up well, and you don't get that feeling of falling backwards if the feet were flat and you have a bar on your back. So it sets the body up to squat well. And if the feet have good pressure and there's a good balance of pressure, you're going to get a good pronation in the feet as well as upstream. And it's easier, much easier to hit good depth and do so comfortably than to do so with the squat, where you're really forcing an athlete who doesn't naturally get into those positions in those positions. There's a lot of reasons why many of those athletes with tighter ankles really do well with something like a high handle hex bar deadlift. And so starting with that total body squat function without trying to force the knees forward, I think is a nice happy medium, because doing that a lot can actually improve that range of motion without necessarily needing to really stretch the tissues or do any static or even necessarily a lot of dynamic ankle mobility as a warm up to squat. It's a very global thing more so than a local thing. On the local level, I do think a little bit of stretching for the calves is no problem. I mean, I grew up doing like calf slant board stretching, and there was these like little blue calf stretchers, and it always felt good. It never felt like a problem. I don't think it would really become an issue necessarily unless you were doing, like, for example, the Polican split squat, where you're pushing the knee over the toe. And I think the ATG version may have made that even more so of an exaggeration of the knee over the toe. I'm not actually sure with the original. Eventually, I know they put something under the heel to make that easier for people. But if you did a lot of that kind of split squat with the foot flat and really shove the knee forward consistently, I could see that stimulus potentially lengthening out or putting more, you could say, slack in that posterior calf and Achilles. But even then, I think there's athletes who could do that and probably be okay. I think there's others who may be more negatively impacted. And you could also look at like Stefan Holm, the high jumper, who did a fair amount, to my understanding, at least in the training video that came out with him and Donald Thomas, of him doing deep squats and his knees were going forward. I think he may have had lifting shoes on with a little heel elevation there, but needless to say, he was definitely doing deep squatting and one of the most reactive athletes ever. Clearly a lot of foot and lower leg tensegrity there, and so it didn't seem to bother him. So just again to say, there's athletes who can do that, like, and that kind of almost kills that urban legend, I guess you could say, of the track coaches and the Achilles, if that is actually a true thing, that people were concerned about that. But I think that ultimately, if you can just set squats up well, you can set the foot to have good pressure and it doesn't force the issue. I think that's a good land for pretty much everybody. The other thing I'll say with pronation, and so defining pronation as well, if you're not familiar with the term, it's, I'll use Gary Ward's, or I like Gary Ward's, it's the flattening of all three arches of the foot. And I believe that's with assuming there's good pressure on the ball of the big toe, the ball of the pinky toe, and then the heel. So you have this balanced pressure and then those arches can flatten. That being said, in a lot of athletic movements, you actually don't want those arches to flatten. You want the foot to stay in this arch position so you can, the opposite of absorb, you can deflect yourself off the ground without going down into it too much, or maybe the knees bend or the hips bend. But if you have the feet flattening too much when you're trying to be explosive, that could be an issue. I just think it is good to, one, have a centered pressure pattern in the foot. And I think that's the most important. Like if you go to those Dr. Scholl's machines and in the store and it tells you, okay, this is the red part of your foot, there's too much pressure here, there's not enough on this part. I think that's actually the most important thing. But then once you have that, being able to squat on that or do squatting motions, I do think is helpful. Being able to get the knees for it is helpful. I personally just really focus there on single leg ability, center of pressure there, good general squatting mechanics. I don't stretch athletes' feet necessarily or calves, but I think a little bit is fine. And I think you could run into a little bit of trouble if you really loaded up extreme for a long period of time. That could potentially be an issue. But the interesting thing is I actually haven't seen any direct stories of that being the case. But I do think anytime you try to force a joint into a position it doesn't naturally go, and you're only focusing locally, like on the Achilles and the tendons, and you could maybe the fascia or the connective tissue to try to shove that knee forward, and you're not focusing on the total body mechanics or the pressure, isolating one at the expense of the other, I generally think that's a bad idea regardless. So a little bit of a complex question, one that I actually had to put some good thought into exactly how to answer it, but I hope in that answer you find some helpful ideas for considering those mechanics. Next question is Joe Ferrigno 25, and he asks, what exercises do you like for improving shin angles for sprint acceleration? And so this is, again, a great question, and there's a lot of ways to go about the shin angles. The most simple one by far is just do resisted sprinting, just do sled sprinting. Anytime you have a resistance cord or anything you're pulling against, even running up a hill, the body is going to react really subconsciously by more favorable shin angles for early acceleration. And so, the question would be, well, if an athlete is doing a resisted sprint and they still aren't getting those favorable angles, well, then what do you get into? Then you could go to more sled pushes and marches where they can slow things down. There are ways that are better than others to do those marches. I tend not to prefer the straight marching back, like the post position, kind of stomping straight back, because that favors early knee extension and not the hips working like they should. But if you are going on a sled and you aren't getting that, you can revert. And again, it's kind of like a Hatfield squat. You have the hands on something, so you have more points of stability, and there's a little bit more sensory room to focus. But I find that you generally want to find these places where there's not a lot of cueing per se, that the athlete can operate and the coach needs to say the least amount for the ideal thing to happen. So those are big ones. There's also bottom up and top down pieces that you can work on that shin angle. And of course, the bottom up, you have track starts that are out of blocks or a 3-point start in the combine. These are more bottom up by nature because there's more points of contact on the ground versus top down, which is a more falling start where you fall into shin angles. Both are great. I like to use all of it, and I also like to explore within all of that. So, for example, if you're doing a falling type start. So let's say you're in a semi-squatted position, you're falling forward until you reach a point of contact you feel good with. You can find a certain shin angle drop and then you sprint out of it. And you can have athletes do a range. You can say, all right, I want you to let your shins drop into as deep of an angle as you can. Now go. All right, now you could also contrast it with, I don't want your shins to drop at all, or even start your shin with a bad angle and try to go. That would be feeding the error. And you can work that as well. That actually can be very effective when you go to sprint normally out of that. So summary here is any sort of resisted sprint will facilitate those angles automatically. Athletes who struggle with that can go to more of a sled push because there's more points of contact. Just don't overcoach the sled push, because a lot of times athletes can do it pretty well and it actually can be overcoached quite easily. And then there's bottom up and top down. And within those, you can explore the shin angles. And I can just go into a few more. So for example, even like you could do a mountain climber start. So you're in a 4-point position, hands and feet on the ground, and you're just doing mountain climbers back and forth with the knees. You could explore the angle, and I talk about this in the Sprint Acceleration Essentials course, as well as a lot of other information on this, but you could explore some of the facets of that mountain climber. You could explore the ankles, you could explore the angles of the shin and how it feels to explode out in certain positions. A lot of times you can just let athletes just do it and their body is going to figure it out themselves, given enough differential learning aspects. So some avenues there that you can certainly explore. I do think it's a lot better to go about that than hey, you need to be at this exact angle mentality. All right, we're going to set you up and you're going to be at this angle and you're going to push now. The body works on a little bit different rules than that. So if you can just give it the basics and let it explore with the basics, and then also add that flavor of competition, as well as an athlete having the strength to back that, then you're going to be able to get a good result there. Next question is from Marcus Lindner. He asks, are there any textbook resources regarding ISA-based training approaches? Unfortunately, there's nothing I'm aware of yet. I think it's all more mentorship type things, more courses, a lot of course, podcasts and those kind of things. The best thing I read was a book that I don't think is in print that Pat Davidson put together that is the basis for his Rethinking the Big Patterns courses. So that would be something, if that book exists, that would be probably the best text I have come across. But all I saw was a preprint edition of that. Next question is DT Notorious, and he asks, how and when would you use the one set approach that Bobby Stroop uses? So this is really interesting because I remember when Bobby was on the podcast, he was talking about athletes having them only use one set of French contrast training, and instead of, I think, more typical 3. And for me, with French contrast in particular, I wouldn't say that I have used the one set with any regularity, but very often I've used, because I think that the traditional in a French contrast, which if you're not familiar with a French contrast, that's doing a round of a heavy lift, like a squat or a heavy half squat, and then an explosive plyo or a longer contact plyo. You could say like a depth jump or something like that, or a squat jump. Then it's a fast lift. So it could be jump squats or a hang squat clean or a repeated band repeated band jump squats, anything like that. And then the next thing would be a fast plyo. So it could be a quick single leg line hop or a quick repeat up and down hop onto a low box. So within that circuit, Bobby talked about using only one set of that. For me, and it may have been around this time, it got my wheels turning as to how to approach progression in volume. At the time, I would always start French contrast, that series, with 3 rounds, because it's kind of like 3 by 10. Whatever you're doing, 3 rounds is a good place to start. And maybe it was around that time too that Kieran and Flat was talking about. I think this may have been before the actual podcast with him, and I think Jake Jensen may have been the originator of this. But the idea of just doing 1 by 20, going with 1 by 20 as long as you could till you stop getting results on it, then go to 1 by 14, then go to 1 by 10. And then when that runs out, or maybe 1 by 8, something in that range. But then when that runs out, then you go back up the ladder to a set of 20. And then I think, don't quote me on this, but it's like, then you would add in a set of 14. So do 1 set of 20, then do 1 set of 14. And then it would continue on. But basically, it went on the principle of it's almost backwards to what we tend to think. We usually think, oh, we'll put more volume first and then taper down to less volume. But this was a system that started with the smallest dose of volume and built up over time and built into more sets over time once the results of just one set was extinguished. And I think that's such a great principle because it's very rarely that people see how far they can get on only one set of something. And it's really great to give the body a chance to get really far on only one set of something. It reminds me of a lot of, it may have been the Easy Strength Omni book I was reading by Dan John, really just talking about patience. And in the book, Dan had quoted his throws coach from, I think, Utah State or Southern Utah. And it was Ralph Mahon. And he had said, you can either start slow and go fast. You have two options basically with training. You can start slow and go fast, or you can go fast and then go faster. And basically the moral of the story is, if you start with a lot, the only way to continue is you have to keep one-upping that. And when you look at the length of a career, if you're looking at 4 seasons in college, or especially if you're looking at someone who's just starting lifting as a freshman in high school, or maybe they're in middle school, you have to ask, well, where are you going to go from this? And so in the midst of a lot of that, I rearranged some of my system with French contrast to usually in the fall, like with the swim team, for example, and the sprinters, we would do 3 sets of French contrast. And then, of course, when we get close to the taper, we would go down to 2 or 1 set or something like that. And that's a very typical way of approaching it. But I switched it to actually just going 2 in the fall and telling the guys, hey, I want you to get as much out of the 2 sets as you can, and then we'll give you another set later. It was like if the championship was in March, it was like January, February, I would give them that extra set. And it wasn't honestly quite as patient even as the set, as the series that Cure had talked about, that Jake Jensen had the original idea with. And I believe Cure was saying that there was guys who were on that initial progression with only 1 set of 20 for a very long time. Maybe their entire freshman year, they were still gaining. And someone who is gaining on a single set of 20 for their whole freshman year, it would make you think, well, if I would have given them 3 sets right away, I'm probably not helping them, or 3 sets of 10 or 8 or 4 sets 8 or whatever, because just think of how much more you have to go when you start with 1 set versus starting with 4. And there's also this, I hope I don't get too far off on a rabbit trail, but there's a lot of track athletes who don't start even lifting at all till a little bit later in their careers. Like I believe Stefan Holm didn't start till he was 19. And once he did start lifting, his performance jumped quite a bit, substantially. But Stefan also peaked in his late 20s or right about close to age 30. And you would think, well, okay, if he started lifting and doing all the intensive stuff when he was like 14 or 15, it makes you wonder, well, maybe he would have peaked at 23 or something like that. And it's just, to me, it's always really interesting to just take a step back and look at that long game and look at some of these systems that really respect the long game. And I think 1 set is really an epitome of that. So if nothing else, take a step back and see what 1 set can do for you. And I think 1 set in some ways is also an intuitive thing. You know, funny enough, when I started lifting, I'd never heard of 1x20, but somehow, and this was not in the Kmart manual, it came with my dad's concrete lifting or set of lifting weights. I think it was more like 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 8, 3 sets of 5, whatever was typical in the 80s and 90s there, or whenever that manual came out. But for some reason, I just settled on 1 set of 20 with stuff like bench press. And funny enough, I did it every day, which probably was a mistake in hindsight. But it was 1 set. And I was like, well, I'll just do 1 set and just do it intensely. And I actually had a lot of success as well, just doing 1 set of 10 in bench or things like bench press later on in life. There was a podcast recently where Rafe Kelly, it was his podcast, and he was talking, it might have been with Cliff Harsky, I forget, but he was talking about how in the midst of all his parkour training and everything else he was doing, which is very athletic and dynamic and takeoffs and landings, and there's a lot of strength involved in it, that something like 1 set of 10 in a squat or a deadlift was a lot. That was enough given everything else that he was doing. And I think that's another thing with the single set we often don't consider as an athlete who's playing a sport or doing things that are very intensive. They already have a lot on their plate. There's already a lot of buckets being filled. And so it's just, again, helpful to see just how far you can make it on a single set in those situations. So for me, a lot of times, my landing point in many ways, you do use 1x20 and 1x14 with a little warm-up set of 5 oftentimes. I do a lot of 2x8. I do a fair amount of doing a set of 5 and then one set of 10. The set of 5 being like just a warm-up and then a set of 10 to 12. So as I talk about this, I don't necessarily use one set truly often, but I use 2 sets a lot. And a fair amount of time, it's 2 sets and a single warm-up set, things like that. Even in my own training, I will say too, the French contrast, I do think because it's 4 movements, I think you could definitely get away with a single set very easily there, especially when an athlete has a lot of other things going on. Something I'm personally doing, and I'll wrap this up with this little piece here, is I do a lot of sandbag lifting now. I have sandbags in my garage. I really enjoy it. I'm just at a place in my life right now, and having gone through a lot of different training methods, that I really like just having 2 sandbags of different weights and just doing a lot of things with the sandbags. And then when I'm done with those on my strength days, so just doing squats and deadlifts and cleans and presses and various things, I have a trap bar in my basement, and I'll go down and I'll just do 1 rep, just 1 rep, and just to kind of get that one singular strength stimulus. That's it. And it's been a really interesting experience so far, and I feel good doing it. So I'm sure you could do a set of 10 or you could do more, but something I'm working with right now, I just think the moral of the story is a single set can go a long way when there's a lot of other things on one's plate. And also a single set with that 1x20 system, you can do a single set of a lot of different things as well, even getting into some of the auxiliaries and injury prevention type methods. Okay, next question is Nicole Jenkins, and she asks, how to navigate weekly training and prevent CNS fatigue with a high school multi-sport athlete. And so with this question, it's difficult because unfortunately being a multi-sport athlete today is not quite what it used to be. And what I mean by that is we used to not have so much club and AAU, and there was just not, there's just so much busyness. Kids are just slammed with games and competitions now, and there didn't used to be that imbalance within multi-sport work. So it's difficult. It's almost like trying to make the branches of a tree nice or pruned or whatever it is when the trunk is bent and misaligned. The trunk being that core schedule, that core competitive schedule. But within that, I will say, I think that the main thing to look at is those athletes, and maybe this fits with the single set idea, is that their bucket in so many ways is already full, especially when they're doing other sports and club sports. And a lot of the work that you do with them needs to respect the parasympathetic system. So you have the sympathetic or the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is more the recovery oriented system. And so within that recovery system, things like body weight isometric holds. So long body weight holds, like Jay Schrader calls the iso extremes. And then he also has athletes do breathing or sequential breathing that helps with the coherence of the body. So for example, nose breathing, 4 seconds in, 8 seconds out. Trying to make that exercise almost a meditation or a relaxation exercise of sorts. Within that too, breath work and meditation work is great. In working with athletes who carry a lot of academic and sports stress, I've never had a single complaint about doing extra time or spending extra time doing breathing work at the end of a session. Even breathing work as simple as, hey, everyone go ahead and lie on your back. And I'm just going to put a count on and just breathe or box breathe along with the count. Athletes love it. I think we don't do things like that enough because, again, there's a lot on athletes' plates already. And so things like that are never a bad thing. I think also things that are kind of like, you could say like foam roller-esque, but in the world of like be activated, acupressure, RPR, just kind of like that general understanding some of those energetic points on the body and just knowing how to even Logan Christopher had a really good course called Buzzing with Energy that goes through the acupressure points on the body and just how to work those and just taking a little bit more time and being mindful. It is interesting, like be it a foam roller or some of these systems. I do think that the body is complex, and just taking time to understand some of those points can go a long way in helping athletes to feel a little bit better and recover a little bit more fully. Next question is Kevin, MCC 17, and he asks, what are you seeing in your kids' soccer? advice for youth coaches working with 6 to 8 years old. So thanks for asking about youth sports. It's something that I really love doing, especially after working in the college sector for so long. To see that other end of the equation has been really valuable. It's also a lot of fun coaching my kids. I feel like a lot of my strengths actually fit with coaching children. I love playing games. I love working intuitively and just going from game to game and creatively figuring out new constraints and ways to make things more fun on the spot. So that's something that has really fed into a preference of mine in how I like to coach in many ways. I definitely have to ratchet up the structuring, the higher up and the older athletes I work with. But in many ways, or one thing that I've learned in working with younger athletes is that in many ways, when you coach young athletes, and especially with soccer, you see, and again, maybe I could be wrong, and I understand the idea of the kid who's good early is not always the kid who is good later. And I know I can definitely see the reasons for that with burnout, early specialization, or not being good at enough physical literacy early on. But you see in so many ways those kids at age 6 even who are already fast. They're already aggressive. They're already competitive. They like the sport. They can perceive and open and close feedback loops, you could say, more quickly than other kids. And a lot of the roadblocks early, I find, are much more, if there is a roadblock, a lot of it's much more mental and emotional. Like a child, it might just be socially afraid to get out there and play. And sometimes then what I've seen is sometimes that social block will be released, and all of a sudden they go from barely not playing at all or not playing to just scoring tons of goals. And like Austin Jochum has said, sometimes there's just that confidence trigger. The athlete just needed something to give them confidence, and all of a sudden they can unleash those skills that they had inside of them. And that can happen at a variety of ages. And I see it happen quite frequently on those younger ages. And so giving those athletes room to have fun, room to explore. And also with soccer, the thing that I think is so cool is when you score a goal, there's such confidence that comes with that. And the goal every year, for me, you always want to see every child score a goal. And I've even seen it too. It's funny. I remember this so distinctly. There was one child one year who I think the parents were like insanely busy. They had 4 young kids, and their child finally scored a goal, and they were so overjoyed. And then I never saw them again. Like I think in their minds, they're like, okay, our little child, I'll withhold his name, scored a goal, and that was our whole goal. And then we're out of here. Of course, I wouldn't condone that behavior if you're a sport parent, but for them, that's what they wanted to see. It was good for their child's confidence. And then I didn't see him again. But that being said, the process of just doing that is so important. I mean, even when my own son scores goals, he's so excited about scoring goals. You could see people's energy change, especially if they're not someone who scores a lot. If you haven't scored much of many goals, or you haven't scored at all in the season, and then you do, that child's energy changes. And so that's part of the beauty of being able to spend time as a youth coach, is the impact it can make on the confidence of a young child once they learn to play and they can feel those abilities. And of course, not everyone's meant to play soccer or even be a varsity athlete in high school. But I do think it's a great, you could call it a fertile ground to really start getting those, that confidence and the athleticism that goes with it early. I also believe that soccer, compared to a lot of other sports, I think it's the best sport for kids and also it's a great just donor sport. Lee Taft talks about soccer. If you are a non-soccer sport, he talks about using soccer for cross training because there's so much happening close to the ground, footwork and agility and low foot-based change of direction and all those things that go into it. And even like the adductor strength, the low quad strength that you don't even need a squat rack for it. You see the quads of soccer players and the adductors of soccer players through the dynamic change of direction and kicking and lateral kicks. There's so much there that's so good for those roots of athletic ability. So I just think it's a great sport for that. But the fact that it's played, the constraints are so simple. And this would go for honestly, any group of athletes, is you can't mess it up. Like if you're trying to teach children basketball, they have to be able to dribble and be able to pass. And for a lot of kids, that's actually beyond their ability to do that and still have fun. They wouldn't just choose to do that on the playground. They're going to choose to do something a lot simpler. Same thing with baseball, or same thing with volleyball. I hear about like if you're having like second graders trying to play volleyball, it's just going to, with a regular ball instead of like a balloon or an oversized ball, it's not going to be fun. It's just going to be something that's more for the parents than it is for the kids. And so that's where soccer is so good. And I really enjoy it's a sport that really is for the kids, and it's a joy to coach, and it's a joy to watch my own children play that. And I think it's a great donor sport for other things down the line. The last thing I'll say too, and this would be for anyone who is in the youth sports realm, and honestly, even if you're not, even if you just want to have a sense of how do you select just games that are fun and at the level of the group you're at, is TeamMojo is a really good, it's an app, and they have great YouTube videos. And I actually use it to gauge, like if I'm at my son's baseball, I don't coach my son's baseball. He did baseball this last year and he just turned 6. And I kind of gauge this is probably, I'm sure people wouldn't like, if they knew I was like looking this up on my phone in the stands, like they probably wouldn't be a big fan of it. But like I'm looking at the TeamMojo games for these kids, and they're all just so much fun, super imaginative. They're very interactive. There's very little standing around or lines. And I'll look at that compared to what the practice is, what's going on with the practice. And usually a lot of times, unfortunately, I'm sure everyone who has kids in other sports like this probably sees it, but it's a lot of lines. It's a lot more rudimentary and remedial things. It's a lot more boring and just isn't very stimulating for the young athletes. And so TeamMojo is it's just a great place to see a lot of really relevant stimulating training for kids. It reminds me of how Jeremy Frisch trains his young athletes with the obstacle courses and games and balls and trampolines and everything that's going on in his gym. So yeah, training soccer has been, and I will say too, the last thing before I get to the next point is just the imaginative. I'm butchering that word. I can't say it right now for some reason, but imagination. Children are so wired for that. And a lot of it makes me think about the creativity needed just the playmaking creativity at higher levels of sport, whatever it is. There's a certain level of imagination that also comes with that. And I do think that like the imagination of a child, and a lot of the TeamMojo games fit with imagination and imaginative play. And, you're not necessarily the coach in this setup, you're a pirate or whatever it is. But I do think that, a foundation or a base of joy and a base of imagination can be really a solid framework or groundwork, whatever the young athlete decides to do later on, even if it's not in sport. I think that, or even just general movement, or if they're getting into the arts and anything like that, I just think that's such an important piece of it. And even I do think imagination-based skills also fit into mental training skills and abilities later in life. So I just think that's another big piece of youth sport. I could go on for a very long time about that. I know that's not the cornerstone of this podcast necessarily, but I do think if you're talking even game speed, it does start on that level of the youth. And it's a good place, even if you don't work with the youth, it is a good place to understand where everything comes from and where it all starts. All right, next question. Just Jumari asks, good exercise examples of external versus internal torque for athletes who want to jump higher. So yeah, this came off of the Tales of the podcast I did last week with Chris Chamberlain and DJ Murakami. Awesome podcast. If you didn't get a chance to listen to it, check it out. And just quick definition as well. External torque, so that would be rotation that starts from the inside of the body and goes towards the outside, like a sumo deadlift, for example, or if you did a push-up and the pressure was all on like the outside edge of your hands and the inside edge was off the ground, that would be an external torque way of doing a push-up. Internal torque is the opposite. That would be like doing a deep squat where out of the hole, you're letting those knees come in to create that compression. Then, of course, you're going back into external rotation, but it's basically things that are a lot more compressive in the middle. DJ uses torque sticks a lot. So the torque stick is like that Mr. T bendy stick that you squeeze towards the middle. Lifting a sandbag, you're squeezing it towards the middle and creating internal torque to lift. It's a very natural way of lifting. And so external versus internal, and jumping is a good example here. And I'll give you the example of a sumo deadlift, which is external, versus more, let's just say a deep front squat, which is a lot more internal. So when I was 16, and this, hopefully you'll be able to make the connections through this example, I was doing a program called The Science of Jumping. And within that program, it was recommended, it was basically like a bunch of depth jumps, essentially done low frequency, so like once a week. And within that program, I was doing all these depth jumps. And then after the depth jumps, they recommended 4 sets of 8 deadlifts. That was the guy's main strength movement for jumping. And I remember trying regular traditional deadlifts, and I felt like I was rounding my back a lot and not doing it right. I didn't have a coach, but I felt doing sumo, I switched to sumo and it felt really good. And so I just kept progressing in sumo. And I put a lot of weight on my sumo deadlift ability in a relatively short period of time. And long story short is my single leg jumping got really good. My running 2-leg jumping got a lot better, but I was really quick off the ground throughout that experience. And I believe I think the sumo deadlift was in Barry Ross's 2x5. Maybe it was traditional, but I thought it might have been sumo, and they paired that with plyos. It would make sense if it was sumo, because that'd be very the external torque chain, the chain that turns everything to the outside. That's what resists the ground. It's what helps you bounce off the ground. And so it would be a natural fit actually to pair external torque things with plyos. They're both compatible in that sense. Unless, of course, you wanted to challenge like the proprioceptive system and did some deep squats between. I know Boo Schexner has talked about that proprioceptive system and how that can be challenged through things like deep squatting. But that's a pair there. And so later in high school, though, it was a year or two later, I finally did the school strength and conditioning class, and within that did a lot of traditional deep back squatting, which is a lot more internal torque driven. I even remember one day, I don't know why I remember this, but I remember doing, I started the year at maybe 225 for 8 or 9 on the back squat and probably put about 20 or 30 pounds on it throughout the semester. And I remember a heavy set of 5 doing, I just remember a wider stance. I remember my knees coming in as I reversed it, but I hadn't been told that was bad yet. I just noticed my body doing it. So it's kind of funny. But those knees coming in, again, it's a lot of internal torque. And my 2-foot jumping was getting a lot better through that time period. I mean, I went from barely being able to dunk 2 hands, 2 feet to catching alley-oops. I remember I caught a 2-foot, 2-hander in a pickup game. I mean, granted, a freshman was guarding me and someone said a nasty back pick on him. I mean, it was like, I might as well have had no defenders. But yeah, to me, that was a big moment. And I also remember being able to just take 1 or 2 steps and get up off 2 feet and do that 2-foot, 2-hander. And that internal torque is a lot better for like a standing vertical jump, a slower speed jump off 2 legs. And in that same time where my squat was getting better and my 2-leg jump was getting better and my slower speed 2-foot jump was getting better, my 1-foot jump was actually it was becoming horrible. I remember, it literally had become so bad I didn't even try to dunk off 1 leg anymore. And this was when the year before I was getting my elbow up to the rim doing windmills off 1 leg. And so I had basically traded torque chains in a way. But fortunately, the result was actually relatively temporary. I remember, I think it was the end of the strength class, and I stopped squatting for a couple weeks. And I got that 1 leg bounce back really fast. It wasn't until later on in life, in like my late 20s, early 30s, where I really put the hammer down with the deep squatting, the powerlifting programs, and subsequently, or I should say sequential, alongside that, the word I'm trying to just say is alongside the powerlifting, I was not playing basketball. I was not doing the movements that kept me elastic. And then my 1-leg jump and my running 2-leg jump really went downhill. And actually, when I was doing just strict powerlifting, even my standing vertical wasn't great. But there was other times where I was basically just doing lifting and even depth jumps, bilateral lifting, depth jumping, all those power-based things. And my standing vertical was phenomenal. Like this was like age 29. My standing vertical is about the best that it had ever been. But then I went to the gym at the end of that program to try to dunk. And I remember off of the run, I literally couldn't even dunk. It was really bad. And so that would be an example of a very internal torque chain oriented training program with very little respect for the external. So that would be some main things there. Another thing too is in a running jump, you actually have a split. And Chris and DJ and I didn't get to the split nature of their programming, which I mean that torque chains or chi torque, that torque chains is Julian Pineau's, that's what he came up with. And then they took it into something called chi torque, and they have split torques and all these things. And in reality, things like throwing a javelin and jumping off 2 legs, it is a split torque occurrence where, and it's going to be a little bit, it's not going to be strictly one or the other, but if you're doing a running 2-leg jump, that straight leg, the very last leg to hit the ground, that's going to be a straighter leg. It's going to run more like a single leg takeoff, and that leg will be more of an externally rotated, external torque chain oriented leg. And one of the reasons I know that is because I was doing this like pre-fatigue test one time where I would max out, like I did single leg hip thrusts, resisted to absolute or as fatigued as I could. And then I'd go jump. And I remember I could fatigue my left glute maximally and then go run and do a running 2-leg jump and still get up within 1.5 inches as high as I could. But if I fatigue my right glute, which is the second to last, I couldn't even barely get off the ground. I mean, it would be like 12 inches worse almost. And the glutes are actually part of the internal torque chain system in Pinot's system. And so that second to last step, that's a lot more flex. Like if you watch that jump, that leg bends to almost 90 or even to 90 degrees in very adept 2-leg jumpers. That's where that leg requires, I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's literally both internal and external rotation kind of working together with that leg. But that leg does demand more of that internal piece. So I think if you are doing like deep squatting programs, that leg specifically is actually, I think, where that really shows up and can help a 2-leg jumper the most. But obviously you want muscle balance and those kind of things. I don't think you want to just do pistol squats on that leg and just do a bunch of like, high knee bounds or something on the other leg. So that again is where that can show up. And then there's other things I had written down in my notes here, like a power clean. I found that doing power cleans from the floor, which actually works a little bit of both chains. Off the ground, it's more internal. Once you get to that hit point, it turns over to external. But I find that doing the movement off the ground can help the change over to the external happen quicker. And in that sense, I think it's athletic enough where it can help that 1-leg jump out as well as the 2-leg jump out. If you do a clean and you're really slow to turn over from internal to external torque, I think it's not necessarily a great thing. So yeah, ultimately the other thing too is internal torque, even though a lot of athletic reactive movements are much more, a lot more in the most cases, external torque dominant, it's still good to have a level of balance in the internal torque change. So just doing some tonic, like lower weight sets of 10 base deep squatting for knee health as well. I forgot to mention that example from high school. That year that I was doing the sumo deadlifts and the plyometrics and depth jumps, I actually was having a fair amount of knee pain, and that actually had my progress being kind of wavy, very up and down. And that was definitely an issue. And then once I started the deep squatting, I literally had no knee pain again for a very long time. And I think part of that's there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the way you could say the slow movement, the slow force works with the tendon. Keith Barr's talked about that. I think that's one benefit. But I believe another benefit was actually if you do, and I've found this too, if you do too much like sumo deadlifting or knees out type squatting, you can actually imbalance the torque chains. And if you aren't doing enough of that VMO chain, internal torque chain, deeper knee bending with that priority, you actually can end up with knees that aren't so happy with you. So I think that for the sake of balance in a jump program, having that level of even like 1.5 squat type stuff where you're doing more emphasis, even it doesn't have to be heavy weight. In fact, I don't think doing a bunch of heavy weight with that 1.5 squat is necessarily ideal, but I do think doing a little bit of it through a more of a range is good for that balance within the scope of those more reactive activities. And in some ways, in just simplifying the whole thing, you could say but that's why I like the sumo deadlift and the squat example, but simplifying it too, you could just say partial range or top half squats and deep squats. There's also a lot of it just within that without even necessarily getting to the knees in or out. But if you want the fullness of the muscle balance, then getting into knees in, knees out, internal and external torque does offer that layer of understanding. And I think that's really helpful. Next question is Trevor Harris, and he asks, what is your learning process from the time you take in new info and ideas until you apply it? And so for me, I think this has changed a little bit throughout my career as a coach. I know early on, it was a lot more scholastic, book learning and notes. And a lot of that, though, I just didn't feel confident with. And of course, the reason is because it was not experiential yet. It wasn't experiential through coaching. And the only experiential place in many ways would just be through my own workouts. And so for me, ultimately, when I learn something, it's either going to go into experiential practice in my own training, in which I'll use like a voice recorder a lot of times, either during the workout, which can be a little bit of a buzzkill, but sometimes if I'm walking back between a longer sprint and I was listening to music during that sprint, I'll be getting some notes. I do notes afterwards, and then later I do a transfer of those notes into my up note. I also sometimes do written notes in that time. And then with clients, it'll be learning something. A lot of times it might be from a podcast guest, a mentor, a conversation, or something from my own workout or that made it into my own workout. Then it's something that would happen in a client session. And then in that client session on the way back, there's usually a voice notes or series of voice notes that end up getting written. For my track coaching, for example, I have a large Excel sheet with a lot of different tabs based off different facets of high jump, be it constraints, cueing, like scoring tables for different types of track events that would relate to high jump performance, notes from practices and those types of things. So it kind of goes from small notes that end up getting transcribed later. I find though I'm very good at writing a lot of notes. I'm not great at really sorting them and organizing them elaborately later. It's usually just enough to get something out of my brain and written down. And for me, that's usually good enough to help me take that step in compiling it into something greater. But honestly, just even doing this podcast has been something that has been a massive, and that the podcast really has been a shift for me where it was more learn things from books and then try to take it from there. The podcast allows you to follow up with questions, and then as well as learning from mentors. And the more people and the more I expand my network in the field, you're able to ask those follow-up questions. And in asking questions, that also helps with that fuller understanding. And I should mention that as well. It's just the art of question asking, I think, is a really huge piece in finding understanding. It's been absolutely essential in my own development. I mean, I can't tell you how many questions I must have asked to Darian Barr in my time working and training with him when he was when we were both in San Francisco training at tracks there. I mean, lots of questions. So that was definitely something that helped me as well. So, and Trevor, I know you're very much in the experiential. I know you've talked about the experiential piece and learning as well. So I know we're both on the same page there, and I appreciate you asking that question. Next question here is Zach Campbell, and he asks, what is a favorite speed complex when doing max B, fly 10s, and then slash excel or acceleration complex? And so, hey, if it's max velocity, I have to go with at least the core. So this is like a starting point. It's a starting point I would recommend for anybody if we're talking complexes and speed. And I've probably mentioned it on this podcast before, but that is the Chris Korfist and Dan Fichter DB Hammer inspired, but I think they took this in their own unique direction where it was a fly 10. So it's a 4-part thing, kind of like French contrast. And I think so many great complexes have, it's like a quadrant. There's 4 things. I mean, you could do 3, but I don't know, 4 just kind of rounds it out well. So anytime I do athletic and speed-based complexes or French contrast, it's kind of rare that I do 3. And I sometimes I wonder why that is. But anyways, I digress. Fly 10 is the first piece of the complex. And then in their original, it was prime times. So like straight-legged bound. And I think I know Chris has also done flex-legged bounds and probably does a lot of that or would do that in this complex now. Hurdle hops, or I don't think it was hurdle hops. I actually think it was like 3 altitude landings. I just write hurdle hops because it's a little bit more ubiquitous or wide, common knowledge and that kind of mechanism. And then a single leg line hop. But the single leg line hop is the endurance piece in that. So the fly 10, obviously a short burst. The prime time bounds would be a short burst, like 20 meters. The depth drops, it might be 3. And then the single leg hop, though, would be like 30 seconds. So that's the long. And that comes from that DB Hammer piece where you have things that are short and you have things that are longer. And in that spirit of Jay Schrader and however he was connected into the DB Hammer, whatever the stream of consciousness that came from, the long... and Mark Wetzel has talked about this, and Rob Assis and I have had conversations on the podcast about this, but that long piece has the capacity to help, or doesn't just have the capacity, it helps recover that shorter piece. You feel better, you feel maybe not like 5 seconds after doing the line hop, but you give it about 3 minutes, and you're starting to feel pretty good. Your muscles feel awake and alive, and that lactate is starting to fade a little bit. And it kind of fits with how you feel playing a pickup game of basketball. And so within those 4, there's a lot of ways you can go with that. To me, it's more so, it's not necessarily those exercises themselves. And I'm sure Chris and Dan would have a similar sentiment here. In fact, it'd be cool to do an episode with them and see some of the different ways they've taken that complex. But I believe so much of it is just, one is that time, or that contrast between a short and a long thing. In fact, if you wanted to simplify it and just make it 2, you could just do a fly 10 or fly 20 and then contrast it with that single leg hop or something that is longer in nature. Honestly, you could even do, I mean, this is a much more difficult piece perhaps, but doing like 150 meters as fast as you can, then going back and doing a fly 10. I actually take that where instead of maximal many times on something like the single leg hop, I actually opt for something that's very rhythmic and slightly submaximal, more for the sake of I'm not necessarily trying to like max that lever out or drop that off, or like taking that to the point where athletes drop off, and I use that as a metric. I take that piece of it and try to make the rest of the complex better by having something that, yes, is longer, but I also put pieces of rhythm on it that I feel also are good for the system. And my main goal is at the end of that single leg hop, I really want you to be really good on that fly 10, fly 20, whatever it is. Sometimes I'll use even a sprint float sprint series into the fly measurements. And then within the other pieces too, I think there's a little bit of mix and match options, like that altitude drop. You could do a single leg altitude drop. I'll do medicine ball throws sometimes. So a max vertical medicine ball throw for height, or a backwards overhead shot put throw or something like that. I'll even put abs in sometimes, which sounds crazy. People would maybe see that as a little bit heretical in the speed training world. But sometimes the thing with abs, and by abs, I don't necessarily mean like just sitting there doing sit-ups. I mean like doing maybe a higher intensity hanging leg raise or a lying leg twist with a medicine ball between the knees to really engage that like glute and adductor. Well, more so adductor, I should say, not as much glute, but the adductors and glutes are connected. But by doing that, you're engaging the obliques and the adductors, which are involved in the running cycle. And in some cases, if you do like a really good speed workout, if you do abs at the end, it can be more of an afterthought. But I find when you loop it in the main system, it's a little bit more meaningful, because it's like, oh yeah, I felt my adductors and my obliques on that one, and I felt those a little bit in that sprint as well. Or maybe and you don't necessarily have to like do a burnout set like you would if in after abs, after speed abs. You just do enough to provide a little bit of stimulation to those muscle tissues and get that system working. So that's where I maybe divert a little bit. Again, I think there's a lot of options, but just breaking it down to the simple core of it all is that Chris Korfist, Dan Fichter complex. To me, that's where it all started. And I know Chris had said that was like a staple when I think he was at York, and his teams were just laying down awesome times and seeing a lot of improvement. And of course, I think Dan probably used that, I'm sure, as well in his track coaching. And so just a really great place for all of us to start there. Want to get fast? I think it's volume 1 or 2. Whatever it is, get it. It's probably, I don't think they sell it for that much. So there's a lot of complexes in there that are really cool. Acceleration, somewhat similar. I mean, you could do that, and you could, if you wanted to, replace the fly 10 with something like an acceleration, a 20, a 30, a sled sprint. You could have and with acceleration too, I'll just say before this becomes very spread out and complicated, is just simply having heavy and light sprinting. So a resisted sprint and unresisted sprint, a resisted sprint and unresisted sprint. And whatever way you want to wave that and format that can be a very effective contrast. You can put other pieces in there, but those two I find are a very strong core. I also really enjoy a complex, and it's not so much a complex as you could call it like a Bulgarian descending, where you just start with a heavy sled and just start taking plates off as you go. You do 2 with a certain amount of weight on, take a little bit of weight off, do 2 more, and you keep going down. And by the end, you're feeling pretty darn fast, super simple. So that's another piece that I really enjoy. Again, I may have mentioned it already, but if you want to learn more about some complexes, contrast, dig more into the acceleration piece, I have my Sprint Acceleration Essentials course that has a lot more information there on sprinting, acceleration, and the motor learning that goes into those circuits. Next question here is David DESQ Esquivas. I think Esquivas. I'm probably mispronouncing your last name, David. I know how to spell it, but I apologize there if I'm mispronouncing it. So wanting to relearn how to long triple jump at 29 years, where to start? Just keeping it simple. I think that, and this kind of goes with the youth sports piece, is a play-based approach to jumping. And so often I think when we pick something up later, especially if you have more of a team sport or basketball or even soccer background, we kind of look at it as, all right, I'm going to do these. Here's all these plyos I'm going to do. Here's all these sprints I'm going to do, which is great. I do think you can improve quite a bit. But to me, I really enjoy putting things, and this is what I do a lot, even for my established long jumpers, masters long jumpers. I like putting things in complexes. I'll just lay one complex out for you with long jump here that I find very effective is Your first movement would be something like going over low hurdles rhythmically. So you're doing that. Second movement is a target-based long jump. So this is like the Ruzan study I quote frequently. So short approach long jump, put a target in the sand, runs kind of like parkour. It's fun. Mix the target, make it shorter, make it longer. Find a way to feel like you are winning that movement. Next thing you could throw, like I mentioned, that med ball twist abs. You could do a vertical medicine ball throw. You could do hurdle hops. And then the last one would be something longer, that single leg line hop. Maybe it's a little bit of a longer sprint. Anything that's that longer nature, you can repeat that cycle and you're going to get a lot of just general good quality work in. I think another thing too, just being a little bit older, and I've realized this more and more as you think about the shape, the general physical condition, and that includes aerobic that you were in playing basketball, all those elastic contacts. I find, especially for older athletes, if you're further away from team sport, find a structure that gets you elastic contacts, makes it fun, gets a little bit or enough of the aerobic system, not so much you get fatigued, but enough to really ignite that piece of the equation, that recovery piece. Honestly, it does even fit with elasticity a little bit, that expansiveness, and it's a great system to work with. Great you're trying to get back into that. I remember working with the Darien Bar, I really started getting back into long jump at age 33, 34 after not doing it for at least 10 years. And it was so much fun. So best of luck to you in that journey. And thanks for the question. Okay, time for just a few others. I know there was more questions, but whatever ones I don't get to, I will make sure I roll over to the next time. I'll make sure I get to your question. Ignite Performance Vault asks, how important is training RSI and elastic qualities for 1600 meter or 3200 meter athletes? So basically elasticity for distance runners. I believe it is very important just because distance running, the more efficient every step is, ultimately less energy in each step. That's going to mean every step you're going to have less fatigue, you're going to have more energy at the end of the race. And it's a big deal. I know Dan Bach had said something about cross-country runners actually having better elasticity than some of his team sport athletes, like a basketball player. And that would make sense that you would occasionally get a cross-country athlete who just because by virtue of so many ground contacts, they're really good at that RSI piece. It doesn't mean they're super coordinated and can infuse the rest of the body into like a running two-leg jump, but that baseline calf kind of hoppiness, I've seen that. I've worked with like elite 800 runners who have phenomenal RSI. I mean, phenomenal. There is that elastic bounciness. So for me, though, it shouldn't necessarily be an ultimate measure. Like it shouldn't be, and I'm sure, this goes with the territory of anything you train, shouldn't be an end of itself. But for me, I like to find that piece. Yes, you could do plyos. I like doing, and for distance runners and those things, I think that they tend to be people who are more like steady and consistent. They can do well and enjoy more rudimentary plyos and extensive plyos. I just really like getting that stuff more through like hurdling. The more I can get out of hurdle complexes, be it like fast dynamic walkovers, anything involving like low key, low level trail and lead leg stuff, I think is great because you get kind of that hoppy rhythmic piece. And I think the rhythm is really important in developing that, not just lower leg, but total body elastic response. But you also get a lot of really good hip flexor and hip mobility. And it's things that it's not like you have to go out and say, all right, now we're going to train hip mobility. Now we're going to train ankle, stiffness or foot or toe strength. You're getting it all in one piece. And it's also very track related if you're doing something that involves hurdles. I just love hurdles. I like the more athletes I can get doing hurdle-based work, the better. So, but beyond hurdles and beyond basic rudimentary plyo stuff, I think that chasing RSI obviously too far. Not necessarily something you don't need to be doing depth jumps or single leg altitude drops beyond a certain point. For those athletes, that rhythm piece, and maybe that as well. It's not just setting up 4 hurdles. Maybe it's setting up 12 hurdles and saying, hey, can you stay rhythmic? Can you stay bouncy? Doing the movement barefoot and going through like some of the types. I guess it probably isn't necessarily the easiest thing if I'm saying, yeah, just do hurdle drills, because it's like, well, what hurdle drills? There's a lot of good stuff on YouTube. To me, it's always those, there is at some point too hurdler specific where it's like, okay, yeah, this is really intensive 1-step drills and a popover drill that's probably beyond the reach of a typical distance runner. But even just doing like fast walkovers, or you'll watch high jumpers do drills where, for example, and this is great for any athlete, literally I would put it it's almost like a physical education curriculum, stuff that is really good for both elasticity, bounce, and rhythm in any athlete. I've seen a number of high jumpers doing this, and a lot of really good high jumpers are really good at this. And again, they're great at reactivity, but stuff where you would have hurdles and you would, let's say you're hopping on your left foot, you get to hurdle 1 and you're going to lift your right leg up and over that hurdle. And now you're hopping on your right leg all the way to the other hurdle. And then you're going to go over it with your left leg. You're stepping over it with your left leg. And then you land on your left foot, holding that right leg high in the air, hopping on the left leg, get to your right one. You can do so much with that. I love that one for the high jumpers I work with. And you can see so much in a lot of tendencies, elastic, reactive, coordination. And it's something that, again, I think it's easy to, I'll just say this, the more integrated I can make things, the better. I feel like if I could pick, if I had a track athlete, I'm going to high jump here, but you could easily say a distance runner as well, a miler. If I could have that high jumper or miler be really good at a plyometric, like let's just even say it's like a bounding variation or something, which is great. I love bounding, or maybe even more specific to plyos. Let's say a double leg hop. They're really good at like a double leg hurdle hop over low hurdles or something like that. I would, which is a good thing, but I would actually rather them both be really good at the 300-meter hurdles. Because if you watch any 300-meter hurdler, and I like watching like Sydney McLaughlin for this, like she is so elastic and bouncy, but that so much of that revolves around the hurdling. And I'm sure she'd be good at the plyos. I'm sure she probably does some level of plyos, but for her and her body type, she gets that bounce training out of just hurdling. And to me, that's ultimately the goal. You look at track and so many great triple jumpers, high jumpers, long jumpers, they also run the hurdles. And you watch how athletes set up and go over the hurdles. And there's like these extremely fast contacts that are faster than in traditional plyometrics. And it's also done in conjunction with the whole rest of the kinetic chain and the hips and the hip flexors and the mobility in the adductors. And I could probably go on. I'll just say, do more with hurdles. Hurdles are awesome. I think that that's like the lost plyometric in so many ways. And that's actually something I'm working on more of a formal curriculum with that I think is going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So ultimately, get RSI and do a lot of hurdles along the way. Okay, time for one more question here. So I will pick here, let's go with LTSB Rose, which is simply how to get into the industry as a college student who wants to learn more and get better. And so for me, and I'm assuming this would be more towards, I mean, this is the interesting thing to me is sports performance is so interdisciplinary. You have within it such a wide range of ages, anywhere from almost more of a physical education curriculum all the way up to specialized like high speed or more of a track and field side of it. And so within that, I would just try to spend time with, I think a lot of times it's like, okay, I'm going to go to this sports performance facility, or here's a local facility, or I'm going to work with this college coach. But to me, find as many iterations of this thing we call sports performance as possible. Find people who specialize more with youth. Find people who work with more older athletes or professional, semi-pro. Find people who work with high school. Find people who are more in the speed side, the output side. Find people who are a little bit more in maybe the PT, biomechanics end of things. Find what resonates with you and find the thing you love. Because ultimately, that thing that you really love is going to be the driver. It's just like we talk about athletes' superpowers. I think there's superpowers. There is an importance in being a generalist for sure, like having a touch on all of those aspects. I do think that's really important. But ultimately, that true passion, that reason you got into this thing, and the thing that you enjoy doing yourself, you love doing that movement, that style of training yourself, and you can intake that and run it through. You can embody it. That also helps your learning. And I'll finally say too, there is that generalist piece as well, where the more places you go, the more coaches you can learn from. Do their training, feel what it feels like. Try to understand their process, not just through what they say, but by getting into their system. And I'll leave with one story that I just found interesting. Is I trained one day. Matt Cooper, who's been on this podcast a number of times, was training with Gary Marinovich, who's the brother of Marv Marinovich. And this was, I think I may have already been down. It was a couple hours south of San Francisco. And I either was down there already or it was an excuse to go down in that area. Paul Cater's down there. And so I met Gary it was at a MMA gym or a boxing gym. And training with Gary is an experience unto itself, because it is hard to describe that man's intensity without actually being trained by him in person. And it's interesting because you would look at the Marinovich system, a lot of it, and it's like, oh, it's a lot of balance stuff, and it's slant boards, and it's physio balls, and it's, making sure we train all the little in-between muscles and not the big muscles, and, whatever you would think with that. But that man trained those movements like David Goggins, or a mix of like David Goggins and, I like a intense track coach. I mean, it was like, but also with this reactivity where he constantly would make sure your mind was fully engaged. He would never let your mind wander. He would always change up the movement to keep that, you could call it salience network, engaged and your full attention, and would drive your full attention into velocity, balance, proprioception, rhythm. And I don't think, it's funny because you could see videos of that and not get that fullness by not actually going through it yourself. So it was awesome having that experience, and definitely left an imprint on me. And so that's the last piece of advice there I would have for you in making your way in the industry. It's a big industry. There's a lot there. And I think there's still a lot of corners to expand in the industry as well. And I'm also interested to see how it continues to evolve in the coming years. And thank you all for those questions. Those of you who I did not get to your question, I'll make sure that I save it for the next time around. Appreciate you all. Thanks for tuning and listening. I'll see you next week.